La Normandie de ce va-et-vient permanent entre guerre et paix.
Ils sont des défenseurs de la liberté et on les applaudit bien fort.
Il faut créer un mouvement global pour tout simplement dire non à la violence, non aux guerres.
Vive la Normandie, vive la démocratie et vive la liberté.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the World Forum Normandy for Peace here at the Abbaye aux Dames in Caen, in Normandy. We are more than 1,200 here in this May tent for a day of debates and exchanges. Next to me, as always, Frédéric Bedos, the founder of the NGO the Imagine project. Give her a big applause. Thank you. It is a privilege to be here to collaborate on this forum, Normandy for Peace. He's Vice President of the region Normandy, in charge of European affairs and international affairs, as well as the promotion of the Normandy, François-Xavier Priolo. There are thousands of youth visiting the forum. I would like to welcome more than 100 high school classes that are here yesterday and today, together with their teacher. As you know, Normandy for Peace is really an initiative that is for the youth, for the transmission here in Normandy, a territory that is at the same time a place of memory and a place of today and future anchored in its DNA. Give a big applause for the youth that is present here today. As I want to recall, our forum is streamed directly on our website, on the normandy.pourlapaix.fr, on the YouTube channel and on Instagram. Please use our hashtag NPP2026. Yesterday we had a very nice first day, and there was numerous of you on the Village for Peace. You've been able to live through fascinating highlights, particularly the one on Europe, lots of emotion also during the roundtable on Gen Z, and also tens of debates, of workshops, of lots of signatures at our bookshop, etc., etc. It was a rich and intense day, but this is only halfway. So we're going to continue on this today in the best way possible. Ladies and gentlemen, it was the 14th of February 2003 in New York at the United Nations Security Council. He was the French Minister of Foreign Affairs of Jacques Chirac. The United States of George W. Bush, following the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001, they declared the war to Saddam Hussein because of the alleged existence of weapons of mass destruction. In the name of international law in defense of multilateralism, to this day, France said no to its traditional ally. The option of war can seem the quickest, but let's not forget that after having won the war, you need to build peace. Have we learned everything from what happened 25 years ago? Never international law has been threatened as much as it is today. Never multilateralism has been so much questioned. Never reason has been attacked so much. What is his point of view on the state of the world? It's folly that seems to be now hedging the international relations. We are happy to welcome here the former Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, elected members, how can we save international law? I measure the urgency of this question. It is part of those that stops us from sleeping when we're looking at the images of war, the threats, the civilian victims, the destructions. Remind us each day how much the world order is fragile and is threatened. But to answer in a useful way to this question, we need to, of course, define what the danger is. International law does not die under the bombs. It dies when the individuals and the nations stop believing that it is valid for everyone. The main threat today is not the material threat. It's the failing of trust in its rationale and in its universality. to answer the questions, how can we save international laws, we need to go through different points of view, different stages. International law, is it really threatened today? Should we save it? Can we still save it? And last but not least, how can we save what can be saved? Because I want to start from here. International law, it's not a rationale per se. Its justification is elsewhere. It is in what we celebrate here, in the peace. Not the law, sovereignty, nor the United Nations are idols. They are only valid if they allow to have a just peace and thus a more sustainable peace. It only is valid as objectives that are absolutely indispensable to achieve its goals. Sadly, the violation of international law, it's nothing new. Just like the violation of internal law by criminals, but the ones like the others, they were hiding in the past very often their violations and their crimes. The novelty, the radical novelty of our times is the fact that the head of the first world power to say we are beyond all forms of international law. He does not even pretend like the dictator being the source of any type of law of he is exempt. Donald Trump plays, in order to use the terms of the great writer Antonin Artaud in Heliogabalus, the mad emperor of the 3rd century, he plays the partition of the crowned anarchist. When a head of state can publicly threaten to destroy an entire civilization and announce as a political program the destruction of bridges and power stations of a country. So if you want to be more clear, announcing publicly that he's going to commit war crimes that could be tried in the common law, or in international law. This is not just the law that is being attacked. It is the actual diplomatic language and the red lines that are crossed. The international law is not based just on texts. It is based on a political culture of being measured on a common grammar of things that you do not do, even in wartime. When this grammar is being destroyed, then the law, international law, is not a common rule anymore, and to which everyone submits. And it becomes a weapon, among others, in the struggle between the powers. In these past months have been extremely rich in the violation of international law and far too poor in adapted reactions. France, the failure in France and Europe in this area has made the world even more unsafe. I want to say it clearly, Donald Trump is just a symptom of a trend that goes way beyond him, and it has started far before him. We measure today the weight of the precedent cases, Iraq, and in certain cases Kosovo, that have contributed to mainstreaming military operations outside of any legal international framework. We can see the comfortable way with which the imperial logics are constantly coming up with safety reasons or historic reasons to overcome a law and start war. Crimea, Donbass, Greenland, Gaza, West Jordan, South Lebanon, south of Syria, we are witnessing a contagion of narratives that ignore international law in a race to the abyss. Everyone tries to favor its own issues, thinking that he still has the strength and the time to do it. Everyone is wondering, thinking maybe tomorrow we'll need the having the nuclear weapon in order to ensure the inviolability of its territory, which can only encourage, and that is the risk of the wars we're seeing in the Middle East, that can only encourage nuclear proliferation. Where better than in Caen, a martyr city, the city of liberation, where can we remember in what ruins the idea of international law was born, organizing a multilateral order founded on respect of national sovereignties. It is born out of the destruction of civilization during the war, horror, hunger, death at an unimaginable scale. It was born out of the destruction of politics in totalitarianism that was negating even the main principles of the legal order and the international order outside. They are indistinguishable from one from the other. One cannot survive without the other. The first question I would like to address today is international law. Is it really threatened? And the answer is yes. The threat is real and is first and foremost targeting the trust. So the first main danger today is not based on the material violation of international law, but on the fact that people are forgetting its rationale and that people are not trusting its universal value anymore. Never in our history the international relations have been entangled in such a network of rules. The national laws and the international laws, they are combined. Many international laws are, for many companies, a weapon against arbitrary. We see unacceptable violations against the courts and the members. Judges of the International Court have been personally threatened, have even been prevented in their everyday life and their work. But it's not like that law dies per se. We are fiduciary. We are an institution that is based on trust. It can only exist when people believe in it, when people recognize it, and when people expect it and fear it. It dies, international law, and law dies when we don't take it seriously, when we don't think it as a common rule, but a variable tool depending on the circumstances. Many attitudes that we see more and more widespread are killing this trust. First of all, there is the friends of brute force that only believe in balance of power and that need a destruction of the international rule of law in order to reinstate the law of the strongest. They're the exceptionalists for whom the law has no more value when an existential value is invoked. There is the sceptics that reduce the law to a weak prayer, and they're willing to file it away among the old dusty stuff. And you have the sceptics that want a limiting law, international law for them, for others, and of course free to choose for themselves. They consider international law as a contingency and not as an architecture and a normative framework that would be imposed on everyone. Today, there are 4 pillars of our international orders, of a liberal international rule-based order, that are simultaneously being pushed over. First of all, there is a rule fatigue. We see many examples of the failures of law, and we forget the huge cost of what would happen if there was no law. Then the international debate has gone from a forum to an arena based on images, emotions. The immediate reactions dominate, while the procedures of the jurisdictions seem slow, cold, and uncertain. And then the United States went partly from a position of leadership, legal leadership, to a imperial dominating power, from a legitimist hegemon where the force is irrational per se, and everything needs to confirm permanently the US supremacy. And finally, there is the change of the fact that there is varying levels that destroys trust more than any discourse. And we've seen it recently where after the start of war, the war of Gaza started, and for the European countries, the rule that they were applying against Russia in the Ukraine, they had to certainly apply it in Gaza, and that was quite difficult for them. A universal law, but applied selectively, loses its authority, its legitimacy. If the risk has always existed, it's becoming even worse today, at a time of continuous media streams, in times of universal information flows. The comparison becomes an exercise, a daily exercise, and led by everyone. refusing the fact that they are the policing force of the world. They are moving away from the crisis, and they are not supporting the application of the rule of law for fragile populations, but at the same time they invest more and more in the usage of force at the service of their immediate interest by going beyond any rule and ignoring any common rules. Second question: should we save the international law? Here again, the answer is yes, but we should not idealize it. We need to recognize two difficult truths. The rule-based order founded in 1945 was based on a cynical aspect and a hypocritical aspect. Between 1945 and between 1991, it was basically based on a minimum value of balance between the US and the USSR. The final safeguard was not the law in itself, but the fear of mutual destruction. The reduction of conflictuality in some areas of the globe was based on the interest of the two superpowers, as it shows the example of the Suez Canal crisis, 1956. After 1990, the supposed golden age of international law was based on the very fragile combination between the American power and the legal formalism. This balance was unstable. It was only based on the goodwill and the self-discipline of the policemen of the world. So the policemen of the world. On the September 11, this role broke down. The double language is not an accident. It is a fundamental vice of the order that wanted to build its order on a particular force. But the society can even fall into the legalism, an approach that is purely mechanical of the way law functions. It can become an empty husk that adds pain to pain. Diplomats, journalists, legalists, legal experts, humanitarians, everyone needs to look clearly at its own responsibilities, because peace is a culture, and each culture can be lost. It is the political elites that have fragilized most international law in the last years by ignorance, by ease of mind, or by opportunism. Where are the great political efforts for Sudan, for instance, for Ethiopia, for Libya, for Yemen, for Lebanon? All too often, everyone waits for the rival to stumble or protect its own interests. So we need to save international law, certainly, but we need to save it without idolating it, not by restoration, as if 1945 could come back intact, but by refounding it. Saving international law today, it's not coming back to an imaginary golden age. It is to recognize what in its actual form needs to be revised in order to build an international law based on the relationships among humans more than on the balance of the power of one individual over the other. Second question: can we still save the international law? Yes, the answer again is yes, but not in the actual mechanisms that are meant to ensure it. Let's be honest, the immediate outlooks are dire. The cycle in which we are, it's a destructive cycle, and it's self-fulfilling. Each violation of international law without being punished becomes a precedent case. Each facility given to a major player weakens more and more the belief in the universality of law. Each violation feeds into the next one, and this cycle is made worse by polarization of democracies. Public opinions fed by instant flows that feed into their emotions. They want immediate responses, which international solutions can't provide. The tribunal of opinion, the kangaroo court of opinion, goes before the rule of law, and this is made worse with technological changes. With the recomposition of the world hierarchies, we are coming into a phase of competition between major superpowers in a new intensity without a common language in order to be able to limit the effect. China and the US are facing off in a systemic conflict without plainly recognizing any kind of referee that would be above them. But there is a inverted dynamic. The world of the 21st century is an interdependent world, and that is at an unprecedented level. The flows of data, of capitals, of goods, of people, of viruses, as we've seen during the COVID, they do not stop at borders. This reality creates a common need for a framework, for arbitrage, for common norms, common procedures. So the need for law is not disappearing with the return of force. It becomes even more urgent. The ceasefire between the US and Iran has shown it very clearly. A ceasefire is not just a stopping of the conflict. It can only exist legally and politically if it's based on a common interpretation of mechanisms of verification and a minimum agreement on the scope. But the United States, Iran, Israel, Pakistan, they do not have the same understanding of the ceasefire on the nuclear program, on the state of the Strait of Hormuz, on the inclusion or not on the conflict in Lebanon, that is where the war is raging in the last days. So it is a point of view that changes completely according to considerers. And this is not yet peace. This is just a very precarious interruption of fighting that is linked to hindsight, to back deals, and that is hanging on a thread before the combat starts again. This need even exists in among the powers that are more against international power. It would be absurd to reduce the United States to the Trump administration. There are companies, universities, investors, federal states. They need stability. They need trustworthy arbitrage. They need safe logistic chains. China itself, in order to project its economical power, needs normative frameworks that need to be previsible. The question is not to find out if the international law is becoming useless. We need to find under which new form it can become credible again. It cannot be saved in its actual shape. It's too top-down, too dependent of a well-meaning hegemony that does not exist anymore. But it could be refounded if it founds in the interdependency of the world its material basis, in the plurality of actors that need it, its political basis. And this refoundation cannot be just the coming back of a Western-based single center. The fact that Pakistan was mediation, the United Nations, the pressure from Europe to include Lebanon in ceasefire and guarantee and warrant the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz shows that a more pluralistic order is trying difficultly to emerge. Saving international law means that we need to give it not just a single guardian, but numerous supports, not just one geography of legitimacy, but a more wider coalition of institutions and of powers decided to give its credibility back. And finally, fourth pillar, how can we save international by redoing politics?
The first line of action is renewing international law by articulating it better with domestic law, giving it further efficiency, which requires several distinctions. First, with a common foundation of international law and a corpus of laws that vary. Within the UN, we need to be able to include legal standards based on the respect of international law internally and externally. Common jurisdiction on the Court of Justice of the EU, permanent standardization with international law, benefits when it comes to circulation of people, goods, and capitals that can attract people to participate in this common foundation. We must also maintain compulsory and universal common law to guide and prevent people from violating it. That's the role of the International Court of Justice. Between sanctions and coercions. Sanctions have taken a huge space in our world, but the results can be deeply criticized. From Cuba to Iran, they almost never through a regime while making the people pay a huge price. Recent studies show that around 564,000 additional deaths happened from 2010 to 21. The UN should be the exclusive center of any sanction policies to avoid the Commonwealth, such as financial system and freedom of seas, become unilateral instrument. Finally, we must make a distinction between traditional and fully universal international law that match the new challenges of the world: nuclear proliferation, climate change, collapse of biodiversity, deviations of AI. These super risks justify to create really common new laws because no state can be protected of it alone. But the most important part is elsewhere. It's in politics. International law and the corpus of international politics can no longer be a strength without political will. It's an empty shell without any impact on the world. I'm a realistic of the law. I think international law is what can be used to shape relationships based on power struggles only if it's contained. The true idealists that are not in the real world today are not the ones who believe in the law. They're the ones who are under the illusion of almighty powers that regulate and purify. There's an even more important risk. International politics can have the wrong objectives, the wrong assessment of power struggles, and even get lost in using constraint. But there's an even more worrying aspect. When destruction is no longer a tragic mean that needs to be justified, when it stops being collateral damage that is still mentioned awkwardly to become an objective in itself. And this red line is crossed when you no longer do this to neutralize a specific threat, but to destroy a country, its infrastructures, relationships, mediations, and the conditions of common life. From that moment on, the nature of war changes. It's no longer creating a political solution. It's an organization of the emptiness. And it's not just material emptiness. It's moral, intellectual, and almost spiritual, because this type of policy leads to dehumanization. People no longer perceive a society, a people, or a civilization, but a target, an obstacle, and a mass that they want to break. It's also an imbalance of the spirit, a confusion between force and clarity, an imbalance of the vision, which can no longer consider the future than just an extension of the ruins. Nothing positive can come out of a war led in such a manner. You can destroy a lot and rebuild nothing. You can terrorize but not bring peace. You can impose silence but not prepare for peace. Saving international law also means rejecting destruction as a policy, and a reminder that no just order will emerge from just getting used to disasters. No just order will ever come out of silence or indifference. This is why it's so important to say, as Jacques Chirac and General de Gaulle used to say, in all circumstances in Lebanon and elsewhere, we need to name the aggressor and the victim of the aggression. 3 principles must guide us. First, looking for a balance. This is not about accepting the power struggles in a passive manner. We must be able to prevent one single actor from imposing their own law. The great lesson for Europe is simple. The balance of powers softened by the law and trade is the best guarantee against general war. The second principle is to look for shared progress. Cooperation is not something you decide. You need to build it step by step where the common interest is most obvious. Every agreement that is respected, every decision that is being respected, and every jurisdiction that is respected and recognized adds an additional layer of reality in international order. The third principle is sovereignty, our sovereignty. A continent that depends on others for safety, energy, and critical technology cannot defend international law. European sovereignty is not a way to close ourselves, it's the condition for our judgment to be free and therefore for us to be credible. I started by talking about Caen, and I will conclude by talking about Caen. In the summer of 1944, this region met more destruction than many civilizations within a century. Today, it's a space for the future, for the memory and transmission. It was rebuilt, not identically, which is never possible, but in order to make life possible, desirable, and fertile again. And this is exactly what we need to do with international law. We shouldn't pretend to be restoring an old order that was already fragile, but rather reforming, improving, and building with patience and determination on the ruins of an old world, create something solid enough for peace to be possible, honest enough for peace to be sustainable, and open enough for peace to be just. But beyond international law, there are more than rules, as I said. There's a culture. Peace is a culture. The law is the culture of mutual recognition of promises that are being kept and about respecting the limits. There won't be international law without creating slowly a common good that is respected and goes beyond just individual interest. The common good is cultural. When the world protested against the destruction of the Buddhas in Banyans or the temples in Palmyre, they were not just defending statues, they were defending the part that world heritage cannot be destroyed by anyone. A civilization can be recognized by what it did to protect beyond itself. Then there's the environmental common good. The planet is no longer just the background of politics, it's a condition for politics. There won't be stable international law without a shared conscience of the vulnerability of the living world. Oceans, water, climate, biodiversity are not just technical cases. They are the playground where human politics can happen. Finally, there's a humanist common good. No international order is sustainable if it does not rely on the minimum condition that any human life is worth the same, that no people is a strategic variable, and that no power can announce the destruction of a civilization as you would make a threat. When a world leader implies that a civilization will die tonight, we are nearing a limit where it's no longer just the law that is undermined, but the idea of civilization itself. International law requires for us to act together to create this common good, culture, environment, and humanism. Without this, it's just a cold mechanism. And with this, it becomes, again, a political promise. We will never get the people to respect a law they no longer agree with morally, the objective, and its purpose. And we must appreciate how urgent it is and how responsible we are. Let's do this as long as it's possible before a disaster. And let's remember that there are times where true allies don't remain silent. In Phnom Penh, on the 1st of September 1966, the General de Gaulle took the responsibility to tell the US that a great power could be misled and that this needed to be said. Not to break the relationships or humiliate, but rather to avoid being stuck in destiny. And this might be the greatest proof of political loyalty, speaking when keeping silent would mean being complicit. Thank you.
Merci. Merci, Dominique.
Thank you, Dominique de Villepin, for this vibrant opening speech. Your latest book, The Power to Say No, was published in June 25 at Flammarion, and it's of course available at our temporary bookstore in the Village for Peace. And now, the next speaker to join us on stage will stay with us throughout this morning. Member of the Scientific Directorate of the Forum with Bertrand Badi. She's a specialist of Europe and international security. She's also Vice President of the Jacques Delors Institute. She will help us discuss this morning's theme, how to save international law and multilateralism. Please welcome Nicole Lisotto.
Ça ne va pas être facile.
Wow, it's not going to be easy.
J'ai vraiment Je vais peut-être commencer en
I might start by quoting La Bruyère, a great French author from the 17th century, a moralist who wrote the characters. And when he wrote the characters, which is a study of the morals of his century, he felt desperate. He really wanted to speak, but he was under the pressure of his culture, his knowledge, and how he admired old moralists from Greece. So he wrote this, which I think is particularly relevant after hearing Dominique de Villepin's speech. He said, everything has been said, but way too late. Since the 7,000 years of humanity and since they started thinking. And I feel like I'm in the same situation as La Bruyère after this brilliant speech from Dominique de Villepin. I'm not really sure what I can add, but I'll still try to fulfill my mission to introduce this theme, and starting with some very simple things. Just to say that the natural state of the world is chaos, force, violence, and the idea of an international order is a human invention. It's not the natural state of the world. And in this sense, it took 2 world wars, more than 40 million deaths, for this idea of international law that should be universal to emerge. And this is what happened in 1949 with the creation of the UN Charter, and the creation of universal international law that was written by the West, the winners of World War II, but that technically should be imposed to all and to benefit all. This is the first thing we should remember. The natural trend or tendency is violence and chaos. Now, what does international law say? Reminder for the 100 of students we have here in the audience. First, it says that the use of force is prohibited. Using force is prohibited in international relations, except for 2 cases. First, legitimate defense, Article 51. If you're being attacked, then you can defend yourself. And in the case of Iran, the Iranians were attacked. So they're defending themselves, although though we're against the Ayatollahs, it's the law, we should say it. The second exception, using force is legitimate if the UN Security Council considered it is acceptable. That's Chapter 7 of the UN Charter that states that if a state uses force to question international security, then other states can use force to punish that state or bring them back to reason. These are the only two cases of international history where using force is legitimate, self-defense, or in case of a violation of international law by another party. In all other cases, using force is not acceptable because it's an aggression,
que l'on peut,
not
qu'on l'on-
an intervention that could be called in many ways. The Russians call it a special military operation. The US call it a military journey, but in any case, it's fully illegal. Third item. International law, created in 1949, was never fully respected or always respected. For example, the Cold War was a great moment of international history where international law was not respected. Dominique de Villepin alluded to that earlier because the only thing that was being respected was nuclear deterrence. This is how the Soviets ate up half of the east of Europe without any sanction from international law. It has been respected since the end of what used to be called the balance of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the great moment of international law was the first war against Iraq in 1991 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And the entire international community, the US, China, Russia, although China did not have much weight back then, signed a resolution from the Security Council, resolution number 678, and the international community thought Saddam Hussein is violating international law, so we're going to create a huge military operation, most of you weren't born, led by the US with a mandate from the Security Council. Everyone went to Kuwait to capture Saddam Hussein, bring it back to Ukraine, and that's it, back to international law. This was the peak of a society led by international law, but it was unfortunately just an exception, and since then, violations of international law were a standard. But the most important aspect is not dictatorships violating international law, because by definition, they don't respect the universal aspect of the law. What is the most important aspect is when democracies violate systematically international law. And as Democrats, this raises questions. It was the case in 2003 with the US intervention in Iraq, and it was the case last year, and this year in 2026. In 25, the first assaults from Israel and US against Iran, the attack against Venezuela, the Colombian Russian ships that allegedly carried drugs, and the assault against Iran triggered by Israel and the US, with also the destruction of South Lebanon and a big part of the West Bank and Palestine. This is serious. When those who created international law, the US, violate it, step on it, considering it's not important anymore. And for the US, they increasingly started to reject international law. In 2003, Dominique de Villepin knows it, the US tried to keep a straight face, said it's not really the resolution, I think, 1441 of the UN that can justify our intervention in Iraq. And the US and the UK did everything they could to avoid being called an aggressor. And today, in the war against Iran or Venezuela, the US don't even try to justify themselves. They don't care at all that it's illegal. They don't care. And I would like to quote Donald Trump, who said, "I don't need international law. My only limit is my own morality." This is what we call the rule of arbitrary, of one person. That's dangerous. And I'll come back to one question which I would like to ask the panel that is going to join us to try and help us save international law. I think there are two questions that we should ask to try and avoid having the arbitrary choice of one person to become the rule, knowing that this one person is the US, but it could be even worse than Donald Trump's US. There could be a US that is even more unacceptable, fascism in the coming years. We shouldn't be afraid to say it, given the current trend. So there are two questions I'd like to ask, and Dominique de Villepin alluded to them. The first question is international law an absolute principle above all founding principles of international society, or can it be made relative in exceptional circumstances? And when you look at the debates in Europe, you see that there's a divide. There are two ways to use international law in a relative manner against the Atlantic loyalty and the fight against barbarism. For example, in Germany, and Chancellor Merz did not immediately condemn the attacks on Iran. He just said that when an ally is struggling, that is the US, you shouldn't make it more difficult to them, which means not criticize them, which, coming from Germany, a country that only exists thanks to the law. In 1949, when the US wrote the fundamental law of Germany, federal Germany, it was only thanks to the law because Germany was destroyed by the Allies. So clearly, for Germany, international law is fundamental. Merz changed what he said afterwards, but they said it's fundamental, but not as much as the support to the US. There's another example of making international law relative when it comes to the fight against tyrants. And one leader of the EU said, fighting tyranny in Venezuela and Iran is very important. The Mullah's regime is one of the worst on the planet, so we can be satisfied that the use of force was an opportunity to get rid of two dictatorships, Venezuela and Iran. Yes, maybe, but thinking fighting tyranny is above international law means condemning and submitting international law to the arbitrary choices. So in Europe, a democratic space, international law can be made relative against other criteria. And the only country who had a perfect behavior here was Spain, whose prime minister said that this war is illegal, and it's not because you hate the mullahs that you can justify the war against Iran. That is my first question. Can international law be relative? My second question will be shorter because Dominique de Villepin started providing answers to this question, which I don't have. The second question is, shall we use the current crisis and our common anxiety around the future of the craziness from the US? Shouldn't we use that opportunity to reshape and rebuild international law? And the debate is not really happening in Europe. I think this happens more at the UN. Several ideas are emerging or on the table. One of the oldest is that instead of reforming international, we should make it more legitimate, including more great powers like India or Nigeria, other powers from Africa or Brazil, get them to join the Security Council of the UN, not to increase the law, but to provide further legitimacy and strength to the powers who support the law. We've heard about this for many years. This could not be done, but I think this question is crucial anyways. Another idea on the table at the UN is a joint proposal from French and Mexican diplomacy limiting the veto right of the states to make sure that international law is Chinese and Russians always put a veto when it's about defending the people and minorities, and the US use their veto right every time it's about Israel and Israeli policy. And certain countries, including France, are proposing to limit the right of veto. Where's the quote?
Je cite,
In case of mass atrocities. In that case, the right of veto could be limited for the states who prevent applying the law. These debates are on the table. Unfortunately, for now, Europe is not being very creative when in the past the Europeans were particularly creative. They tried to create the law of interference. Bernard Kouchner trying to include the right of interference in international law. Many countries opposed it, the US, the Russians. So we were creative back then, but we no longer are. And Europe should be creative again to save international law. And I will conclude by saying what international law could look like. What is the objective? Of course, the objective is not a perfect world. It's an acceptable world by all. So what do I mean by an acceptable world? I've done some research, and in my library, I found a quote from Lamartine, a great French poet from the 19th century, in Les Contemplations. It's a quote that is written on the Palais des Nations, the UN headquarters in Geneva. And I think it's a good definition of what an acceptable law-based right. The freedom of the weak. The freedom of the weak is the glory of the strong. Thank you.
Nicole, restez là. Une ovation pour Nicole.
A big ovation for Nicole Nisotto that has perfectly met the challenge that was given, starting a speech with La Bruyère and finishing with Lamartine. Congratulations for this introduction to our debate. And just to recall, Nicole, you're going to sit here. For our round table, and we call the fractures in the West. How did we get there, and how this was published in October, last October, in the Odile Jacob. To look at this multidimensional dimension of international law and multilateralism, we're going to be organized around a single round table. This is the moment to welcome our guests. A former minister who's a long time presided the Committee of United Nations for the Fight Against Discrimination Against Women and member of the Consultative Committee of the Human Rights Committee of the UN and head of the Institute for Peace at the region Normandy, Ms. Nicole Amelin. He is our ambassador in the Netherlands and candidate of France to be judge at the International Court of Justice, François Alabrune. Former labor unionist, she's the president of the Administrative Council of the International Labour Organization and delegate of the French organization Anoucheh Carvar. She's a legal expert and she's a criminal expert, founder and president of the Céline Bardet of the NGO We Are Not Weapons of War. Former head of Alstom and is founder of Icarus and author of a book on the American trap that was very much noted when it was published in 2019, Frédéric Pierucci. Thank you to all of you for being here today and your participation on this roundtable. We have 1 hour together to answer this question, how can we save the international law? Even though we had was the introductory speech by Dominique Villepin and then the presentation by Nicole Niezotto, good orientations and good elements for answering. And I would propose that we start with you, Nicole Amelin. We speak about the international order, multilateralism, the most potent symbol of the international order, born after World War II, is of course the United Nations. These United Nations, they are today the target of all criticism, and they seem very powerless in face of all these new conflicts emerging. We've spoken about this since the beginning of the morning. What does this justify? To throw back everything because we say United Nations is weak and useless, or as you propose, Nicolas, maybe revolutionize the system, this governance, world governance system. Thank you. Then I would like to be, how proud I am to see the region Normandy to be part of this new vision of the world order. Is confronted with strategical breakaways that really put us in a situation of great historical responsibility. International laws. We have seen the erosion of international law at the UN every day, a certain law fatigue, loss in efficacy, the absence of reforms of the Security Council. That have sometimes changed the United Nations in a Gulliver tied down by dwarves, and in its incapacity to move. And today we are faced with a major risk, that is also fed by the populism. We haven't maybe not mentioned that sufficiently, that are questioning the mere international law and the absolute necessity to safeguard this common foundation, like what Boutros Ghali was saying. First, the human irreducible, what cannot be negotiable in terms of human values and factors. But we need to go beyond that. And Bertrand Badi said that yesterday. The new humanism, it's the new horizon we need to achieve, we need to reach. What we want, what we're trying to prepare here is this humanistic revolution, the capacity of creating new balances of power to associate it. And that is the challenge, to associate the new generations. They're here together with us in Geneva, in New York, because civil society and the new generation, it's the trust and it's the future. And so we absolutely want that there be a reorganization of the system. We haven't spoken sufficiently about the governance. Governance really needs to be reviewed, and I'm proposing indeed, and I'm not the only one, I propose a equal rights revolution, because the patriarchy, the old ways, is that we're living on an old order. Of course, we need to recognize the assets of this old order, or the standards of the rules that have allowed us to create a universal momentum on fundamental rights. Let's not forget that. And if a wide majority of the worldwide population has benefited from this process, it's thanks to the international law and the fundamental rights of the United Nations. But today, one of the biggest archaism is, of course, the absence of women in the international decisionary systems. They are nowhere to be seen, not in the defense and security architecture, not in the management of the worldwide debt, not in international negotiation, not in the peace processes. And so can we build a new humanism without women or against them? It is impossible. And today, what we're seeing, we consider indeed that this parity, this equal rights revolution is part of this new world order. And without this vision of equal rights, a universal principle of equal rights between men and women, a share of power, because men have been fighting for centuries around power without ever sharing it. And today we need to really consider equal rights as a strategic intelligence, a collective intelligence, the capacity of that we be able to mobilize a new level of action, a new level of power. It's not just a right and obligation, it's an opportunity for the world. And we need to stop considering women as just victims. They are victims, of course, but they're also agents of change. and that changed, of course, the evolution of the world. And the last element, we are on the idea of new balances of power, new balances, it's been said, between North and South, between the new emerging powers. There are new ways of working, creating defining priorities that federate people. And maybe the international law needs to focus again on the basics, on peace, of course, but also what leads to peace, and overcome all the challenges that we have, civilizational challenges with the digital transformation, existential challenges with climate issue, with conflicts, with crisis, with pandemics. It's also on these topics that we can start building the future and go beyond the more political challenges. And I would like to finish on civil society, because nothing is possible if we do not re-establish the link with the vast humanity. And today, it needs to be said, politics cannot do everything. We need to create a new world order that would be based on resilience. Look at what Ukraine has done, that has shown that when a people stands united on fundamental rights, we manage to resist against an overwhelming force. And it seems that today that this capacity of rebuilding a world defining on fundamental principles cannot just save the international order, but create a far more adapted governance, far more adapted to its time. And we are already in this reality because we have just published a general recommendations on equal and inclusive representation of women in the decision. This is the first step of a long, long road.
Merci, Nicolas.
Thank you, Nicolas Amelin. You have just mentioned this equal rights revolution. We could maybe go into this concept deeper, which is important for you. It's a question of the universalism of these values and the place of women in the decision-making process. And on this aspect, we see that there's clearly a gap between the advances of the law and the reality on the ground, particularly with the cultural relativism that is fragilizing the strength of the law. And faced with this, you have just started to open the debate on this. You have taken an initiative which is to create a UNFCCC for women. Yes, this resolution that we have made, the UN vote on the legal rights, equal rights as a universal norm, is a radical change. And it's being followed, and it's a big surprise, even for me, by 100 countries, including China, including Middle East, and it's an opportunity which we should not miss, because if everyone starts to understand that equal rights is a smart move and that it can change things and that it can become a force, then we can really make a strong movement, a step towards peace. And this UNFCCC on women and peace, it's the idea, just like we have for the Climate Council, and to apply this new revolution or digital revolution, and to ensure that we can demonstrate, sometimes technology needs to support the rule of law, we need to demonstrate the smartness and the opportunities to ensure that women are actors of change, forces of peace, and that there is a correlation, clear that it's established by international law, but that we need to demonstrate in our modernity, in our actual modernity, clearly the idea of creating a new system of data and to ensure that we can better analyze the war crimes that are sometimes difficult to document, to be able to better feed into the international justice system. Of course, I would like to congratulate Cécile for her work she does on that topic. And I would like to build a system that is far more evolved regarding evaluation and identification and what we call the ranking, because it is very important that the states know exactly where they stand in terms not just programs of women, peace and security, but they are very interesting, but they do not change much at the worldwide level, but that we can demonstrate what can be the universal strengths of women in the change, because again, the conditions for peace. And I would like to here again highlight and commend the work of Bertrand Badi on peace that demonstrates that peace is not a state of non-war. It is a social, economic, and political construction that requires new values, among them being inclusion, resilience, equal rights. And these values need to be evaluated, highlighted, and graded, rated. And I want to create a scientific tool that allows to evaluate this and prove the results to the world. And we see here the importance, Nicole Amelin, of the return of the political sector, because the will and there's someone who plays an important role in the system. It's the General Secretary of the United Nations. The mandate runs out at the end of the year. There will be a new United Nations General Secretary next year. We had we have received a message from Antonio Gutierrez, and Nicole, could you write? So, message for Normandy, faced with the troubles in the world, what hopes for peace at a time inequalities and climate crisis are shaking up our world. Peace seems to be more fragile than ever. In this tumultuous period, hope is not a refuge. It is the necessity to defending in international against the law of the more powerful and to preserve the human dignity faced with indifference. Peace is not limited to the silence of the weapons. It can build via justice, solidarity, humanitarian access, and the trust between people. It also requires courage, listening, and compromise. This is the sense of multilateralism, preventing conflicts, mitigating sufferings, maintaining dialogue, and building a sustainable peace. Normandy knows the price of the war. It also knows the strength of reconciliation, of common commitment that has built up Europe and inspired the world. Faced with the bouts of our times, let's take in this memory the courage to act for peace. Antonio Gutierrez. So Nicole Amelin, good to ends saying you have to have the courage to act for peace. Wouldn't that be, isn't that the roadmap that is expecting the next General Secretary of the UN? And in all your opinion, Nicole Amelin, how will that Secretary General be able to succeed? Yeah, it's true that we are hoping for a female Secretary General, but let's not fall into the for the idea that everything is fantastic because we have a woman presiding the United Nations. If the system does not change, if there is not a systemic revolution supporting worldwide governance, it would not change anything because it will be prisoner, the female prisoners that will be prisoner of a patriarchal old system. So we have this two-pronged approach. But indeed, first of all, it would be an exceptional ambition, an historical ambition, at the moment where we have so many challenges, strategic challenges to overcome, disruptive challenges. It is fundamental to have the courage to act. But let's not forget that the United Nations is made up, it's the states, the individual states that decide. So the courage will have to be of a courage of conviction, of a vision, and of innovation. And I think that these are the three major qualities that make up that today that we say that we have a new hope. And the topic of this forum in Caen this year is hope. And I hope that in Caen we would be working on the reformation of the United Nations, which we're already working on. I think never a General Secretary will have such a responsibility on its shoulders, faced to peace, modernization of a system that has really made its proof, because today we are in the logics of rupture, of breakaway, of alternatives, of necessary alternatives with the Board of Peace, even though these initiatives have no clear meanings, but they exist. I mean, the new Secretary General, she will probably have to realign an extraordinary mechanism, which I love very much, because I don't think nothing today is able to replace the United Nations under the conditions that we relink it with the entirety of the challenges that are here today, and the fundamental rights and the fundamental value, which is peace, maintaining peace. As you said, Nicolas Meline, a system that has shown its efficacy, and it's not just limited to the General Secretary or to the Security Council that is regularly in the media. So now I'm going to turn to Aniche Carvalho. You preside the Board of Administrators of the International Labour Organization, the ILO, within which you represent. You are the ambassador for France. So this organization is not very well known of the wider audience. It's very old. It's older than the United Nations, but it was created in 1919 after World War I, and it's founded on the principle that there can't be a universal peace and sustainable peace without a decent treatment of the workers. For you, you were a former labor union activist. How is ILO a fundamental organization for the defense of the rights of workers? Thank you for giving me the opinion to present this old lady that is the ILO. So I'm doing here a sidestep compared to my predecessors who spoke about the established order after 1945 to tell you about the established order in 1919 after World War I, an armed conflict that was extremely devastating and painful for all the European countries. And that had decided not just to found a society of nations, that was the first steps of multilateralism, but also an international organization of work, of labor, to answer the issues and the conflicts in the area of the labor relations. Let's not forget at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, we had an incredible number of work conflicts, of labor conflicts, strikes, demonstrations, blockades, tools, factory occupations. And World War I was the opportunity, particularly in France. They named a Secretary General, which is Albert Thomas, who is the Secretary General for Rearmament. He was the first head of ILO, and he proposed to the French workers a form of sacred union in order to lay aside the labor laws in order to support the war effort. And he said that we could also imagine a social multilateralism that would be based just like the Society of Nations and later the United Nations, that would be based on the state interests, so the countries around the world that join an international organization, but also the representatives of the workers and the employers of the same countries, which makes that today this organization, the ILO, I would like to correct what you've just said earlier, that this motto is no sustainable peace, no universal sustainable peace without social justice, brings together in its General Assembly, which is the International ILO Conference, the 180 member states of the ILO, but also the 187 representatives of the labor unions and the 187 representatives of the employers of these countries, of the employer federation of these countries. And the decisions within the Board of Administrators, that's made up of 28 member states, is balanced out, or the consensus which we achieve is founded on the 28 member states, but also the 14 representatives of the labor unions and of the employers' federations. On this basis here, the ILO is an organization that has generated international conventions, international labor conventions, 193 international labor conventions, and that is constantly updated with all the new elements and the new elements coming up, the evolution of the world, of the workplace, the social evolutions, every day by creating recommendations, minimal norms on which you cannot go below, but on which we can build better conditions for workers, but also for economic prosperities of our societies and companies. These 193 conventions, among them we can highlight the 10 convention, which we call the fundamental conventions, because even if the states have not ratified them, these conventions are the bedrock and they apply to all states in the world, which are the conventions in order to stop child labor, banning child labor, conventions fighting against forced labor, conventions to warrant the freedom of association of employers and workers and their rights to collective negotiation, tariff negotiation, also the right to non-discrimination of women and men and women on the workplace, and the global non-discrimination in the workplace. And recently, 2 new conventions of the ILO have become fundamental to answer the issues of health and safety on the workplace. So you can see that all these issues, this is the daily bread of the citizens that are in the workplace, and they are being adapted every day by an incremental effect of these conditions, and their work conditions improve thanks to these conventions. There's, of course, no sanctions, like in the entire UN system at the international level. There is no mechanism of sanction. There is no court that would bring cases against people violating these conventions, but there is a system of lookout that is being placed, of monitoring that is being placed, so the states are have to respect the ILO conventions that they have ratified, but under the monitoring by the employers and the workers and their representatives that can actually file a complaint against the states when they do not respect the freedom of association, the freedom of collective tariff negotiation, or other fundamental conventions of the ILO, and allow this very low-level multilateralism. We're not dealing with big principles here around the world, but that is really anchored in the daily life of the countries in which these rules apply, and that modify somehow the life on the people in the workplace, daily life in the workplace. Thank you, Aniche Carvar. We understand better how much the ILO really works on very concrete aspects, and it also requires finance. The United States are moving away from the UN institutions and the financing of multilateralism. This has concrete consequences on the action capacities of these institutions. On this topic, we're going to show an extract from a movie from the web series that we did by the Boîte à Bac for our forum. We're going to look at the extract and then we'll talk about it. You know, it's easy to criticize its slowness and its blockages, but let's imagine a world without the UN. The consequences of already visible and dramatic. For example, this year alone, following the recent budget cuts by several major donor countries, the UNHCR had to lay off 4,000 field agents for refugees in concrete teams, less tents, less food, and less protection for the most vulnerable. And according to several medical studies, including the one published by The Lancet, this collapse in humanitarian aid could cause millions of preventable deaths by 2030 and the spread of many new diseases. And there you see the true value of the UN and the Secretary General. Beyond the big speeches in New York, it is above all a great machine which vaccinates, educates, saves lives. The Secretary General may not have an army, but he has the strength of the speech and of law. And in a world where the temptation of brute force is palpable, it may be the last rampart against chaos. So, for the ILO, it's been now 2 years that the US have not paid their contribution, have not paid their fee. not for 2024, not for 2025. Concretely, what's the consequence of this for the ILO? Thank you for giving me the opportunity to raise this issue. You need to know that the United States of America are they like the ILO, they're very attached to ILO, not because they want to defend multilateralism, but mainly for protectionist reasons, because defending the rights of US workers, it is a way of creating tariff barriers for the American markets, for the access to other countries that could normally not demonstrate, they could not attachment to social rules that have been defined by the ILO, not because they wouldn't have the immediate means of doing it. So the US do not want to leave the ILO, but they haven't paid their fees for the past 2 years. And I have to say that if in December 26 they haven't still not paid, they will lose their right to vote at the Administrative Council of the ILO and at the International Work Council. So they'll probably pay a little bit in order to keep their rights to vote. But what's very interesting is that the multilateralism outside of the Security Council is a multilateralism where the United States only have one voice. So we need to bring them back to what they are. They are one country among many others. And this is what we have done in the last administrative board of the ILO, which I have just left, where indeed the US did not agree on a certain number of policy decisions that had been put forward by the ILO, among them the issue of the gender equality, because for the US under the Trump administration, there is no gender. There's only sex, and every time a policy wants to promote the equality of gender, they agree with the principle, but it's not the way it's being presented. So they asked for a vote at the Administrative Council, which I've given them as a chair. I should not have, because I could see in the audience that there's a general consensus also in the emerging countries, also in the developing countries, also in the Islamic Cooperation Organization, including in the countries of the Gulf Cooperation. They were favorable to gender equality in the United States. They asked for a vote, they achieved, and there was one vote in favor, against. One vote against. So let's bring them back to their true scope.
Mais cela ne nous dispense pas.
But, of course, we should still look into the structure of the funding of ILO. ILO is an organization where the US, China, and all the EU countries account for 76% of the budget. That's the problem. It's a structural problem. As soon as you leave control to China or the US, who account for 20 to 25% of the budget of ILO, then the way the organization works is being slowed down as soon as one of those major contributors pulls out. Why am I not talking about the EU? Because you need the 27 members to agree first. It's not the Commission that pays for that contributions, but countries individually. And what is happening today is that we need to use this opportunity not to do what the little video clip explained, which was to let go or fire 6,000 experts from HCR, but to see how to reduce the bureaucratic weight that exists in some of those international organizations, to pay people just to get paid to carry out projects, so we can tell them, once we have paid the compulsory contribution, we could demand that you help us. Then these people tell us, no, we need additional money to do what you already paid us to do. This won't work. Well, clearly there are structural problems. We need multilateralism, but we also need to come up with new rules that are more fair. We spoke a lot about the US this morning. After what you explained on the US contribution, we spoke about the virtues of the law, but we can also use the law to serve force and to serve economical wars. I'll turn to Frédéric Pierucci. The law can be used as a weapon, and you personally experienced that, Frédéric Pierucci, when you were leading Alstom, a company that was part of the strategic heritage of France. And in your book, The American Trap, you explained the story. Could you tell us? We are short on time, so let's try to be brief so we can pursue the exchanges together. But I think your experience is particularly interesting. Thank you for your invitation. First, a reminder of what Alstom was. It was a listed company from the CAC 40 with 3 activities: building nuclear plants, top 3, US and Germany, then electricity transportation, and manufacturing TGV and metro lines. Now, it's only this 3rd activity. The first 2 activities were sold to General Electric after the Alstom case. Alstom wanted to become #1 electricity producers, and the US were against that. They didn't want to lose their leadership position on such a strategic activity. In order to stop the progress of the group, they launched an investigation into the company for corruption allegations. I was one of the managing directors of the company. I was in charge of international development to make Alstom the #1 actor. And when I arrived in the US in 2013, I was arrested at the Kennedy airport by the FBI and put in a high security prison. I stayed there for 14 months, up until Alstom and the French government agreed to sell Alstom to a US player. And during those 14 months, I had a lot of time to reflect. The high security prison is not like Prison Break, the show. You cannot escape. And I had time to reflect on how the US used the law, especially on anti-corruption law, human rights, sanctions, embargo, so economic law. And when you look into this in detail and case law, you see that the US have created a body of laws to use it for economic wars. I'll use an example. The law that they applied against Alstom, anti-corruption law, which was created in the 1970s in the Carter administration, but most importantly, it was changed in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War. The US changed the law to make it extraterritorial. What does that mean? It means that starting 1998, all companies that have the slightest link with the US are submitted to the US law. This is done through 3 ways: using US dollars to fund global trade. 80% of global trade is in dollars. Secondly, using US digital tools. If you organize your board meetings with Teams, for example, then it's submitted to the US law. And then the US economical sovereignty. So the entire world needs to apply the US law, and 75% of fines are paid by non-US companies, 2/3 European companies. Of course, these are strategic industries like telecommunications, energy, etc. Focusing on France, over the last year, up to $15 billion were paid by French companies to the US Treasury. And on top of this, billions of legal expenses. So this is huge flaws of economic know-how transferred to the US. And the Alstom case made France understand this issue, and the Sapin de law, anti-corruption law, was passed after that. Frédéric Pierucci, what you're telling us has become a case study of economic war. And after the increase of this phenomenon, it was the end of hypocrisy, and now everybody's organized. You created a consulting company, Icarion, to help companies in their compliance strategy. What can you tell us about how the economical industry is adapting to those new methods? The states reacted. The first state who reacted to extraterritoriality was England, surprisingly, because they were also targeted by the US. British Aerospace, Rolls-Royce, and other UK companies were attacked by the US. So they started creating counter-sanction laws to oppose extraterritorial laws from the US. Then there was France. After the Alstom case, we finally understood this economical war through the law, and that's when the Sapin de law was passed. When there's anti-corruption compliance, there are obligations for the companies. They need to implement programs to implement embargoes and sanctions, and it created a system that allows companies to take a plea deal to the court, etc. So we're protecting our own companies. We're just defending ourselves. China passed mirror laws, counter-sanction laws. And we are finding ourselves in a mix of laws that contradict each other. The US continue to impose their law extraterritorially to the rest of the world. They're not the first, but as soon as you have military dominance, you try to impose your law. The Romans did. We did it with Napoleon. The English did it as well, and now it's the US turn. The Chinese create counter-sanction laws that also apply extraterritorially with other links. And in Europe, there are countries that defend themselves. There's no European response on this issue, which should be there, but it's criminal, so it's the competency of the nations. And we provide support to companies so that they comply. You briefly alluded to Europe. Let's talk about Europe. In November 24, Emmanuel Macron said the world is made of herbivores and carnivores. Europe founded its project on free competition and international trade. Can Europe be a herbivore with the member states and carnivore with third parties? To sum up, can Europe adapt without denying its DNA? Well, on this topic, there's no Europe. There's no Europe because there's no French-German couple on this issue. At least they've been quite divided on this issue for a while. The Germans received a lot of sanctions from the US, just like European companies, Siemens, Daimler, Deutsche Telekom, etc., but they didn't react like we did. For reasons that date back to the end of the the end of the Cold War, the recreation of the Bundeswehr. So it's a very Atlantist country, and we saw it in the speech of Mr. de Villepin when he talked about their position on the current war. So there's no agreement between France and Germany, and each state reacts individually to protect its own companies. Can we overcome that in the future? That's desirable, because else France will need to find allies outside of Europe. Could be India, Brazil. We need to agree with countries that have the same interests in defending their company against the legal hegemony of the US. we saw the two faces of the law that can be used for negative purposes. I'll turn to François Labrume. You're the French ambassador in the Netherlands, based in The Hague, where there is the HQ of the International Criminal Court. You have been appointed by France to join the International Criminal Court. We see that there are many attacks on international law, but we see an increase in expectations for international justice. How can you explain the contradiction between the strong demand and a very variable usage of international justice? Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be in Caen, a capital of peace, and I come from The Hague, which is a capital of international justice. And I'm struck by the fact that building international justice came from a long process. I'd like to explain that. It started in the late 19th century, so even before ILO in 1919. The first The Hague conferences were in 1899, and in 1907 it was the creation of the first universal international court, the Permanent Arbitration Court. Then after World War I, there was the Permanent International Justice Court before the International Court of Justice, and then in the 1990s there were criminal courts for Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and then the International Criminal Court. We discussed the challenges around international law, but being based in The Hague, and when I look at the activities of the International Court of Justice, I see that there's never been such high activity, so many cases. There has never been so many requests from states, including for an intervention in cases submitted by others, or just to provide an opinion from the General Assembly at the UN. So there is an increasing demand. And one of the most interesting examples is a request for opinion received by the International Court of Justice on climate change and the obligations of states when it comes to climate change. This request came from the youth, young people from the Pacific region who can see how much climate change is an existential threat to them. They convinced their government to submit this request to the International Court of Justice. And the court provided an opinion last year, which shows, what did the court say? The court gave a very comprehensive explanation and ambitious explanation of the obligation of the states based on specialized treaty on climate change, but also on human rights, the rights of the sea. So this is a very extensive interpretation based on treaties, but also on customs, although some states are not party to the treaty. So it's a very ambitious interpretation. It also states that if those obligations are violated, then there is a responsibility of the states and they might need to pay some damages. This is an example of an increasing demand in justice, which is due to initiatives from the states, but also sometimes from civil society, and specifically the youth. Thank you very much, François Labrume, for this first answer. It looks like international justice scares people. Else, how could we explain the increasing intimidations against judges? One of the most striking examples is the sanctions from Donald Trump to the judges of the International Criminal Court. The president of the US, through a decree, activated a mechanism that was originally created against terrorists and narco-traffickers. The name of those judges whose mission is to fight those crimes is now part of a list next to the name of ISIS terrorists or the leaders of drug cartels. This is a complete misuse of the system. If the international justice is attacked this much, maybe it means that it has more power than we think. What do you think? Regarding the International Criminal Court, I think we need to realize how much, within a few decades, we've seen extraordinary progress in international law. When I started my career, I remember I used to be part of debates on the project of creating an international criminal court. And I must say that before the change in the 90s, I started my career in 1988, I thought it was an absolute utopia. And then there was a shift in the early 90s that allowed for the creation of something that sounded like a utopia. The court was created with the support of 125 state parties. Other countries were not parties, which is a limit. Then it started by covering many African cases, which was heavily criticized, and now the court has extended its scope of investigation to cases like Ukraine or Palestine. And from that moment on, the scope of action was extended through arrest warrants against, for example, Putin or the Israeli prime minister, which scared some people. And those reactions against the court can be explained by the extension of its scope of action. Of course, we should never underestimate those threats through US sanctions, but also arrest warrants from Russia against the judges. So clearly these are significant challenges for the court. In a moment with Céline Bardet, we'll talk about the criminal court. But when we prepared this roundtable, François Labrune, we asked you with Frédéric whether this high-risk context could make you doubt. You are a candidate to be a judge at the International Criminal Court. When we asked you if it could intimidate you, you said no. And you talked about your grandparents who had to go through the war, and this is a space for memory and transmission. And clearly, international law is a long-term project. It cannot happen overnight. In this moment of truth, everything is very fragile. When we talk about international law, do you think we are at a turning point? When you talked about the creation of the International Criminal Court, you didn't believe back then. Do you think now international law could disappear? I repeat, international law did not start in 1945. International law is the result of a much older process. And of course, international law had its ups and downs. Earlier, I talked about the conferences in The Hague in the late 19th century, which was followed by world wars, which was a disaster. People might have thought international law was over, but between the two wars, there were efforts made to relaunch the law and multilateralism. Then this was followed by World War II. People might have thought international law is over. And actually, I was reading the memoirs of René Cassin, who talked about his experience in the lowest moments of the war. And it's very interesting to see how certain humans believed in it back then and fought to relaunch international law. And then, after World War II, the UN was created and all the efforts to create a standard. Then there was the Cold War. People may have thought it was over or paused, but no. Starting in the 1990s, there was, again, a relaunch. So I think we need to realize that history is made of progress and setbacks. We are in an era of setbacks, clearly, but we need to be more committed than ever, specifically to protect what was created by our predecessors in order to resist the pressure. And I think it's an honor to commit in this direction. Thank you very much, François Labrune. Céline Bardet. This international justice based in The Hague is something you know really well. You contributed to creating its bodies as part of the Rome Statute, which led to the creation of the ICP. Can we say that the creation of these international law mechanisms were a consequence of the rejection of impunity? Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And when I listen to everyone, I'm thinking there's so much to say. But yes, I think this is the common foundation that is fight against impunity. I have a lot of reflections on what unites us. Instead of talking all the time about what separates us, I don't think this leads anywhere. I think we should talk about what unites us, and that's of course humanity. And the fight against impunity touches everyone when you're a victim. So this is what led to the development of international criminal justice. And as you say, it happened with the ICP, created in the early 2000s, but it's also the consequence of many reflections prior on those issues. And the fight against impunity is very important to me. I would like to say something, but when I listen to everybody, I work a lot in the field. And I also am part of the UN, and I agree with you, we can criticize many things at the UN, but it's an important space still. And I work on both levels. And I think we must try and take a step back and think about the people today and what they're going through and what is their perception of this, and how they think, okay, international justice is great, but what about me? There are drones exploding around me, and I get nothing. Of course, this is a caricature. I'm not trying to say you should eat your plate because people are hungry, but still. And I think, and I'm saying this because we have a very young audience here, I think we need to be able to speak about those topics differently, to explain what is the fight against impunity, what we're talking about, basically. We're talking about extreme violence. Is this something that any human would like to go through? No. That's why I'm saying it unites us. And then we need to talk about what you just alluded to, how to talk about the UN to the people, about the justice, who to address, how to explain to people why it matters to them. To a survivor who used to be a slave, sex slave from Boko Haram. I recently came back from a trip, who lives near Maiduguri in a village, why this matters to her, why it matters to you sitting in the audience, why the law matters to you, so you can raise your hand, speak, and not be shot because you take the floor. Why this is important for every one of us where we are in the world. I think this is a reflection we must have. How to bring this issue to the people and get them to understand, because once you understand it's important for you, then it matters to you and you act. It's normal. You act on what makes you strong and helps you live. Well, you said it yourself. You work in the field. You created an NGO called We Are Not Weapons of War that sues and tracks one of the war crimes, that is war rapes. And we discussed it this morning. The issue is that there's unfair enforcement of the law of the war, and when a democracy attacks civil infrastructure or civilians, it's completely illegal, and there's a double standard. How credible is international law when those who invented it don't even respect it, and this double standard is maybe killing the trust in international law, as Dominique de Villepin said. I was listening to Dominique de Villepin and I was thinking we need to print his words on walls, because there's this issue of trust. I think that's the main problem. Thinking that those who are in leadership positions and that led to the creation of international humanitarian or criminal law are the same people who are now telling us, yes, but not really for me, or yes, but here no, or we can make targeted murders because Khamenei, what you said earlier was so important. Shall we mix everything together? We're talking about law, morals. These are different topics. So yes, I think this is clearly a threat to the law. You know, I teach at the Sorbonne University, and some people say the law is disappearing. No, the law is here, the legal code is here, criminal code is here. It's not just escaping. The question is not whether the law exists or not. The question is what we do with it. And that was very well mentioned by Dominique de Villepin. There's the issue of politics and the states. We hear a lot about the US and also the structural funding issue. We realized that the US fund a lot of things. And I think we didn't realize that before. And it's a good thing that we see that the US is funding many things for a very long time. They fund the Special Court of Central Africa. That's interesting, because I would like to know what is their business in the Central African Court. So we are realizing this when they pull out. And I think we need a structural reflection on reforms. Trump is not here forever. Yes, you said it. Maybe it will be even worse afterwards. But it's not just the US. There are many states. And sometimes, every day I hate the UN, I want to kill it, but I also love it because it's a wonderful place. Remember that at the UN, it's one country equals one vote, which means that the US have one vote, France has one vote, and Burkina Faso, Somaliland has one vote. So that's the system. It's very important and it's great. So maybe we should stop focusing too much on the US. And I would like to know what European countries are doing, what is their position, and other countries as well. Earlier, you talked about civil society. I'm part of civil society. And it's important to document things, to have data. I fully agree with you. We need data. We need to understand what's happening. Today, everybody's speaking about civil societies, but then there are budget cuts and funding cuts. And it's not just Trump, it's all states. So we need a reflection on what we're funding, how we can better capitalize on what's being done to lose less money, because I'm sorry, there's a lot of public money that is being spent. We're not sure how. And I think that's where we need to innovate. To keep our vision to fight impunity, which I consider a fundamental common good that we can agree on.
Céline Bardet, we can hear the fire in your voice, and we see there is an ambivalence. We need to truly reform from the ground up in order to really reinstore this credibility and legitimacy of the international law. This is so precious. We can't do without. So, Nicole Niazotto, if you do for the final words. I am extremely impressed. I have learned a lot of things in this roundtable today. It makes me more optimistic than I was at the beginning of this session. So I hope that's the same for you. Yeah, there's still work to be done, but 3 remarks. First of all, you've insisted a lot on the fact that the international law is not just a document. It's not just a manuscript to save from floodings, etc. It's something that only lives through institution. ILO for work, for workplace, so the COP for climate and the UN for peace. and in the various international courts, the international penal courts. So it's these institutions that we need to reform when they deserve it. I find it very interesting on your equal rights governance. For those who've forgotten it, I would like to remind you that the women are half of the humanity on the planet, so equal right governance wouldn't be a bad idea. Or creating new ones, creating new institutions for the topics that exist that are not yet following or submitted or come to international, for instance, regulation of AI, for instance, regulation of internet, etc. So this is my first remark. We need to work on the institutions that represent this international law, that give it life. The second remark I wanted to do is that all this is far more complex than one thinks. There's a kind of a perverse aspect in the use of the law. What you mentioned, Ms. Carvar, on a workplace law that is supposed to protect the workers, and it is used by the U.S. administration to defend only the rights of the U.S. workers. So that was not planned at the beginning. So there could be a perverse or even a sanctification or a perverse use of the law and the international law to protect your preventers. And your experience is extremely illustrative. It's not just law per se; it's law, institutions, and vigilance in the way the law is being used. And maybe the last point, which I regret, is the fact that Europe is absent, but I want to change this into positive. The last point is the huge responsibility that Europe should be carrying in this affair. For the topics I know a little better, the Europeans as states, as a European said, we're everywhere, the IMF, the ILO, and but as the European Bank, we're not there. Apart from the World Trade Organization, we have just an observer status in the United Nations, but we are never as European Union, which is why nobody takes us into. I'll take an example. At the IMF, for instance, there needs to be, it's very complicated, you need to have at least 16% of the votes to have a blocking minority in order to veto a decision of the IMF and the World Bank. Only the Americans, they have this blocking minority. They can veto, they have the veto power. Correct me if I'm wrong. And, well, the Europeans, we have small pieces of voting rights. The French have 6, the Germans have a little bit more. But since the European Union does not exist as a single member, we have no influence. If we'd put all the voting rights together from all the European countries, we'd have 23% of voting rights. So we'd have more than the US, and we'd have a more impactful rights of veto, which is why the European integration is a way to go if we want to defend international law. And I want to say that Europe right, and international right, it's the same struggle. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole Niesotto. I just wanted to remind you a book, Fractures in the West. How have we gotten there? How can we get out of it? Published by Odile Jacob. Céline Bardet. Some days the noise of the world hurts me. That is the book you came out in October 2025 at Studio Fact. In this book, you're going to sign it at the bookstore outside of the tent. And like Frédéric Mercier, present at the bookstore to sign your book, The American Trap, that came out in 2019, was very controversial. We started this morning with an ambitious question: how can we save international law and multilateralism? What we have highlighted is also maybe the issue of why. Why is international law, why is law so important for the balance of the world? Law is the warrant of the respecting of value, ethics, and the individual responsibility and collective responsibility. And in the end, there is no humanity without international law. And there is no peace without humanity. I would like, at the end of this roundtable, I would like to thank all the partners and supporters of our forum, Normandy for Peace. Our partners, the companies from Normandy, Urban Connect, Isigny Sainte-Mère, SNCF, the Orange Telecom, Our forum is also a whole networks of partners with whom we work. We build the different debates. They're all here represented. They're French, European. They come from the entire world, South Korea, for instance. And this is very important. And we also have media partners that are with us, West France, with the Agora West France, the Nouvelle Obs magazine, Diplomatie magazine, and the Figaro newspaper. And also, I would like to thank all the agents, public workers from the Normandy region, the European and international agency, led by Dominique Clos and the entire teams. It's a huge work that they have done to organize this forum, to welcome all our guests. And I would like also to thank particularly Frédéric, and also to the audience, to all of you. Thank you for having been here this morning. Through with your loyalty, your commitment, all those who also follow us online via the social networks. The forum continues this afternoon with many debates, lots of moments to share together. And let's stay together, fighting for peace, not naive. Let's be clairvoyant to understand how we can change. And thank all the members of the round table